When Paul McCartney was 16 years old, his father turned 64. And the birthday that inspired one of the songs of the Beatles, he said, I could be handy mending a fuse when your lights have gone. You can knit a sweater by the fireside. Sunday mornings, go for a ride. Doing the garden, digging the weeds. Who could ask for more? Will you still need me? Will you still feed me when I'm 64? This idea of an older person, he thought when he was a young person that 64 was old. You probably think 64 was old. And when I was your age, I thought 64 was old. As I get older, 64 isn't that old, okay? And one of the interesting things is that we all laugh about aging, but it's a very real part of our lives. I have tried to say this to you gently. I've tried to say it to you nicely. I've tried to say it to you in an encouraging way. Some of you look at yourself in the mirror and you go, I don't like what I see. You're probably the best you're ever going to be, okay? So I want you to think in terms of aging not being some kind of curse against your life, but something that does bring certain challenges. I don't want to go real far into this, but let me say that I'm introducing this way simply because when we get to chapter 5, Daniel is incredibly old. I mean, he is old. I mean, he breathes dust. He is old. And one of the things we have to say is, do you ever feel too old to be relevant? So Daniel chapter 5, somewhere I want you to mark, this is a study on aging, being relevant while old. Can someone tell me from the works of Solomon another passage you could pair off with this passage? Does anybody remember in reading the works of Solomon a particular chapter that was all about the body falling apart? Ecclesiastes chapter 12. Put it next to Daniel 5. When you have to deal with aging, this is a great place to look. Now in Daniel 5, Ecclesiastes 12 says, choose God early because things are going to fall apart faster than you think they are. That's what Ecclesiastes chapter 12 says. Daniel chapter 5 says this, you can get old and be engaged. You can stay, I don't mean engaged like, not that kind of engaged. I mean, you can be old and be engaged, but that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying you can stay engaged in life. You can have real weight and real accomplishment late in your life if you will remain engaged. Now, there are 4 reasons that Daniel stayed in the game of life, and I want you to see that we're going to explore a little bit about how Daniel stayed involved. But first of all, let me just say this. When you take a look at the first 4 verses, this is a story of a feast. It's a story of God interrupting a feast. But here's the thing. Daniel stayed engaged, and he stayed because his world placed great weight on a false foundation. Let me stop and say this. In the first 4 verses, what you're going to see is that his world had become wise in its own wisdom. One of the reasons Daniel stayed engaged is he was a believer in a dark place. Because of that, he did not want them to be lightless. So, one of the reasons you stay engaged as an older person is you recognize that people are living mostly for the wrong things. The longer you're on the planet, hopefully, as you walk with God, you'll come to the conclusion, hey, I think I know what life is about because my walk with God has informed me. Then what I don't want you to do is withdraw into a monastery and let the world go to hell in a handbasket. I'd like you to actually be engaged in it. So look at what he does. He looks at the false foundation of the world. And let me see if I can read the pagan core. This is the first 4 verses. I would write next to it something like the pagan philosophy or pagan core. Belshazzar the king had held a great feast for 1,000 of his nobles. He was drinking wine in the presence of the 1,000. When Belshazzar tasted the wine, he gave orders to bring the gold and silver vessels which Nebuchadnezzar, his father, had taken out of the temple, which was in Jerusalem, so that the king and nobles, his wives, and his concubines might drink from them. All right, in verse 1, he got involved in having a very large drinking party. That's often the first step to a really bad set of decisions. And his bad set of decisions wasn't that he had a glass of wine. That's not what it says. It's not in verse 2 when it says he tasted the wine. That's not what he's trying to communicate. What is he trying to say? When he got somewhat verschnickered, when he got a little bit tipsy, he thought, you know, I'm pretty cool. That's what I am. Let's bring out those vessels from that God of the Hebrews and spread them out. And then in verse 3 it says, then they brought the gold vessels that had been taken out of the temple, the house of God, which was in Jerusalem. And the king and his nobles, his wives, his concubines drank from them. Now, it wasn't just that they used these things inappropriately, although that itself has a biblical description under law. What is the description of, what's the word that describes using that which is holy for unholy purposes? I'm looking for the Hebrew word. Asham, great. All right, Jonathan, man, he is smoking here. Come on, I mean not smoking, but you know. All right. So in verse 4, it says, this is the real offense. They drank the wine and praised the gods of gold, silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone. So they began to have celebrations with God's holy articles. But here's the thing. Now the year here appears to be somewhere, you know, I put down 539. It's actually probably 538 by the time this happens. It's late. The years hang over, so it's the second half of this year. King Nabonidus, who was the co-ruler of the Babylonian Empire, was in a large plain outside the city with his army defending it against this mighty Medo-Persian Empire who had Cyrus as their leader. All right, so inside the palace is Belshazzar. Outside on the plain, defending the city, is Nabonidus, his dad. Nabonidus is just about to take a battle against this Cyrus the Mede, who has now gathered the collection of Medo-Persians. Belshazzar's inside feeling pretty confident about his dad. His dad is out there with the army fighting, but interestingly enough, the nobles are inside having a party. So what it tells you is that he's a little disconnected. Babylon was considered impregnable. It's the older Babylonian city, and it had an incredible reputation for victory. The Persians were considered upstarts, a kind of a newly banded army that was threatening to be a superpower of its day. So I want you to see in this corner, with a larger army, with greater accomplishments, Nabonidus. In this corner, upstarts, people who came out without uniforms, the young insurgent army of Cyrus. Now the problem is Cyrus's army may have been smaller, but it was faster, and they won. What's interesting is that the city had a wall that surrounded it that was nearly 300 feet high. I want you to see that the tower inside the Babylonian city, it was like being in downtown New York. The walls were so high that you could barely see the sunshine. Inside the city, it was considered to be the hugest, massive fortification on the earth at the time. So it's a huge city. By the way, to travel all the way around the city of Babylon and its suburbs was a 60-mile circumference route. This is a huge megalopolis. So when he's sitting in the middle of it, he's thinking that even if they take my dad, it's going to take them half a week to get to me. What he doesn't know is things are going to fall apart very quickly. Now, while Nabonidus was defending the city against the enemies, Belshazzar's inside having a feast. And I want you to understand something. I don't want you to miss the background here because the first 4 verses contain something. There's an old school king out on the plain and a young, youthful, boisterous generation inside throwing a party, while the old school guys are out there fighting the war. And it's kind of interesting because Daniel lived in the city. He's probably teaching school or studying old scrolls or keeping watch on the city or playing shuffleboard with the other retirees. I don't know what he's doing. At any rate, he didn't lose touch. And there's a couple of things I want you to see. He knew that there was a false foundation in the world in which he was living. And here's what I see. First, Daniel recognized the generation had false beliefs that they held dear. So in verse 1, Belshazzar means Bel, protect the king. The prince followed a religion that was based on a life of a god of his own making. So Daniel, as a believer, knew that this new young upstart, it's not his drinking that's his big problem, it's his lostness that's his big problem. He's clearly out to lunch, as we would say. The other thing I know is that if you look at the second half of verse 1, he held a great feast, which means Daniel recognized that the people were living with a false sense of security. They're partying while the world is coming apart. You're going to meet people like this in your life's journey. People who go, well, I don't know what's going on, but let's just go have a party. And they will seem to be disconnected from the reality of their times. Daniel was an older man looking at younger people running his government to the ground, but doing it with a party and not realizing what the long-term effect was. I think the other thing is, if you go to the end of verse 1 and the beginning of verse 2, Daniel recognized that the people mistook excess for happiness. That's a good point. They mistook the idea of excess for happiness. They thought because they had a lot, they were therefore happy. Happy means lots. Guess what? That's not true, is it? You know that's not true. Sometimes it's you can have the most fun of your life on the most basic camping trip with next to none of your stuff. It's not about your stuff. In fact, the more stuff you have, the more time you will have to take care of your stuff. I changed my phone this weekend. My iPhone 4, which is, 4 generations back, finally stopped answering calls. Now, for a phone, that's kind of a problem because that's kind of what you have it for. So I decided I would upgrade to the 5S, not the 6, because the 6 has only a few cooler ways I can spend more money, and I don't need cool ways to spend money. It allows me to wave it and spend money. I don't need to wave and spend money. I need to make it harder to spend money. At any rate, so I get this 5S. Now, this is a very nice little phone, and I'm really happy with it. So you're supposed to just put in your Apple ID, and then everything moves over to it. Everything moves over to it without all the ways you set up every single program in your phone. And if you're like me, this is my secretary. Therefore, my secretary currently is blind, deaf, and dumb, okay? So I am walking around with, all kinds of things going on that I don't remember because it's in my old phone that's reminding me she's shouting from the drawer, I'm in here! And I'm walking around with the blind, deaf, and dumb version that costs a lot more. The important thing is this: because you have new, updated, technological, happening bells and whistles, that's not happiness. You're going to spend more time fixing the stuff that you have. He knew that what a lot of people do, many people they tend to want to escape an impending crisis by just sort of filling their life with stuff. Now, the other thing is I noticed, look at verse 2. The words are, in verses 2 and 3, bring the gold, silver vessels taken to the temple which was in Jerusalem. The hedonistic philosophy is this: if you want it, get it. If it feels good, do it. You don't have to be fabulously wealthy to have that attitude, by the way. Many people in our society live this way on nothing but credit. If I want it, get it. Here's the thing. Pagans exhibit the reality that nothing is sacred to them, and that's what I want you to note there. There was nothing sacred. This is the reason why the longer we go on television, the longer we go on the internet, the more people will trash everything sacred and feel no shame at all. Daniel knew that. And Daniel wanted to stay there through the false value system as people boasted superiority. Look at the end. They're walking around boasting like God doesn't exist. The God of Jerusalem is nothing. Sensual living tends to stupefy people. The longer you live in sensuality, you will scorn values of the past, you'll drop a respectful system, and you'll believe you don't need the old conventions. Unfortunately, you will discover you're wrong. Right now, we're living in a time where the world has decided around us, we don't need the old conventions of family. We don't need the biological ties. And the social services the bill that we're going to pay for this in your generation is astronomical. Because it's absolutely essential that you have ties to each other. What happens, the issue of uncoupling biology from the definition of marriage is you now have no definition. Now, if I love my dog or 6 of my friends, you can call it a marriage. If it means everything, then it means nothing. And that's the point. The king and his men forgot what, or better, who, provided the great wealth of their land. So they walked around strutting their stuff. And here's what I want you to remember. When you dismiss the Creator, you begin to erode the inalienable rights that our fathers have passed to us. All of a sudden, you sort of increasingly license your own hedonism. Now, look at verse 4. Daniel recognized the people became belligerent against truth. Because what happens is you lose shame and then you become openly defiant. They praise the gods of gold and silver. Does anybody believe they thought that gold and silver were actually gods? No, that's not what he's saying. He's saying they worship stuff. They got on the page of who cares about a spiritual reality? It's now, it's fun, it's party. And this thing became like Animal House. Now, people who are taught to emphasize rights and live for physical pleasures make poor society leaders. And Daniel stayed in touch with society. And my point of the first 4 verses is he didn't disengage. Tell me from your life experience what would have been his temptation as an older person when this young whippersnapper and his wild friends started partying. What would have been the temptation for Daniel? What do you think, as an older person, he would have wanted to do? Get depressed and whine about it, you know. Give up and withdraw. These kids today, they don't know what they're doing, you know. But the thing is, he stays engaged. Daniel was engaged in a world around him because he knew he wanted to be ready to be used by God, and he knew the world around him was living based on a wrong premise, so they needed him. All right, second thing I want to say is that Daniel stayed engaged because God hadn't finished his work yet. As long as Daniel was breathing, he felt like God still had a task for him. That's worth noting, by the way, because somebody at some point in your life is going to look at you and say, my friends are all gone, why am I still here? And I want you to go to verse 5, look at what it says. It says, suddenly the fingers of a man's hand emerged and began writing opposite the lampstand on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace. And the king saw the back of the hand that did the writing. Then the king's face grew pale, and his thoughts alarmed him, and his hip joints went slack, and his knees began knocking together. Now, it's a little bit of a graphic way of describing the guy was so scared he wet himself. That's really what's going on here. And so I want you to understand something about verses 5 and 6. Don't forget that God is going to move in accordance with his own timing. And Daniel knew that he could stand by and God would use him if God so chose. Now, I love the word in verse 5, suddenly. God offered no warning of new revelation to the world. And you know, the interesting thing is, do you remember Luke 16? The man, send somebody back to warn my family that I'm in this terrible state. And in the story, Abraham says, wait a minute, they have the law and the prophets. If they don't listen to them, then that's all they're getting. I want you to remember that we have 1,189 chapters of truth, and most of them are ignored even by the people that say they believe them. Okay? What chance does the guy who doesn't believe have when most Christians couldn't tell you what's in most of the book? So the problem isn't that, can we just admit the problem isn't that God hasn't said a lot? I mean, take your Bible and lift it for a minute. It's got some content to it. Is the problem that God's been silent? Is that our real problem? No. Now, what's interesting is look at the words in verse 5, the fingers of a man's hand. By the way, we get the English expression handwriting on the wall from this. That's where it comes from. And I saw the handwriting on the wall has become synonymous with the coming of judgment. And the idea here is, he's so frightened, he turns pale, his knees knock together. Daniel stayed engaged because he knew God wasn't done writing his story. And that's, I think for verses 5 and 6, what I love is Daniel felt like there was still more of God's story to be written, and he was still a part of it. One of the things that will keep you engaged in your world is not that you're going, good, let them get destroyed, those rotten sinners. No, I don't want you to have that attitude. I want you to have the attitude, God still has me here, so there must be a reason. There must be something I can contribute. Okay, verses 7 through 12. Here's a third thing that I spotted. Daniel stayed engaged because people around him were blind. Without a representative of God's people, they didn't know what to make of what they saw. In other words, life doesn't make sense to a person who doesn't know the author of life. So when you know the author of life and you are the believer in the room, everybody else is living in darkness. Even when God speaks, they don't know what he means. So here's what it says in verse 7. King called aloud to bring in the conjurers, Chaldeans, diviners. Now, by the way, we've seen these guys before, and their success rate is exactly 0 in the book, okay? Pretty much every time they come in, it's to try and trick the king into believing they know things they don't know, okay? Then it says, the king spoke and said to the wise men of Babylon, any man who can read this inscription and explain its interpretation to me shall be clothed with purple, have a necklace of gold around his neck, and have authority as the third ruler in the kingdom. Why a third ruler? Because Nabonidus is his dad. That's first ruler. He's second. So he's now offering a spot behind him, okay? And it says, then all the king's wise men came in, but they could not read the inscription or make known its interpretation to the king. Then King Belshazzar was greatly alarmed. His face grew even paler. His nobles were perplexed. It ruined the whole party is what they're saying. You know, everybody started standing around. As soon as God comes in and writes on a wall, it just kills the whole buzz of the party. You know what I'm saying? And then verse 10 says, then the queen entered the banquet hall, because now enter the women, maybe they can save the day. Because of the words of the king and his nobles, the queen spoke and said, O king, live forever. Do not let your thoughts alarm you or your face be pale. There is a man in your kingdom in whom is a spirit of holy gods. And in the days of your father, illumination, insight, wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods were found in him. King Nebuchadnezzar, your father the king, appointed him chief of the magicians, conjurers, Chaldeans, and diviners. Now what's interesting is we don't know, but this appears to be the queen mother, not his wife. Okay, so it's probably a much older woman who said, in the generation before me, there was a guy who was around who used to do this. Verse 12, this was because of an extraordinary spirit, knowledge, and insight, interpretation of dreams, explanation of enigmas, and solving of difficult problems were found in this Daniel, whom the king named Belteshazzar. Let Daniel now be summoned, and he will declare the interpretation. You got to be wondering, first of all, how she remembers him, and second, if they can even think that Daniel can still see, right? I mean, he's got to be like, I'm talking way beyond shuffleboard, aged. So here he is. I can't help but feel that people without a walk with God and without a knowledge of his word are like the blind leading the blind. I mean, the fact of the matter is that she comes in and see, people trust the guy who's had a long track record and walked with God. But what if a professor had to actually show him or herself to be a good person in order to be qualified to shape youth in a university? What if they actually had to show themselves to be decent people before they could be educators? What I love is that Daniel showed himself not only to be knowledgeable, but to go on and live a life of testimony. Daniel didn't sit around and grouse. He stayed a part of the conversation of the community. And those are the words I want you to fixate on. Daniel stayed a part of the conversation of the community. Christians need to understand we can't sit on the side of the road and throw rocks at people. That doesn't give them the gospel. You've got to get into the conversation. And I've told you this before, but I'm going to remind you, do not Bible bomb people. Well, the Bible says, you know, so that settles it, because they don't care. What you can do is take biblical truth and make it relevant. Show them how it actually works. Show them that for generations, the things that the Bible said actually worked in society. But don't tell them it comes from the Bible, because you probably ruined the argument as soon as you mention the word Bible. Daniel was recognized as God's representative. I love the words, there is a man. Look at that description. Look at the description of Daniel. Look at his testimony. In whom is the Spirit. The recognition was about then, not about in the past. Now, his past gave him a testimony, but she didn't say who used to have the Spirit. And so here's my question. My question that comes right out of this verse. As you age, keep this question in mind. Can people still see God active in my life? Don't just tell me about what God used to do. Is God still active in my life? How about the consistency of Daniel? In the days of your father. Here's a question I would pose. Can people count on continued maturity and wisdom from me? Do I still sound wise? Can I just tell you this? You don't know this yet, but you're going to know this someday. Some people, when they get older, actually get dumber. They get sillier. They leave the sense of their youth and they actually move into a living more senselessly. Like, well, I don't really know what's right. We're just going to do this. I think his consistency is to be commended. To offer a positive message, you have to stay engaged in the world because the world needs truth while they're longing for the life to come. They need somebody to tell them what's going on. Now, look at verse 4. Daniel recognized the people became belligerent against truth. They praised the gods of silver and of gold. I think when you see that, here's the thing. Daniel recognized that when he gets called into this scene, people are going to emphasize rights. But the problem is, Daniel also stays engaged so that he can be a light in that dark place. Now, I'm going to verses 13 to 17 for a minute. And it says, then Daniel was brought in before the king. The king spoke and said to Daniel, are you that Daniel who is one of the exiles from Judah, whom my father the king brought from Judah? Get down to verse 15. Just now, the wise men and conjurers were brought in before me that they might read an inscription and make its interpretation known to me, but they could not declare the interpretation of the message. But I personally have heard about you, that you are able to give interpretations and solve difficult problems. Go to verse 17. Then Daniel answered and said before the king, keep your gifts for yourself, or give your rewards to someone else. However, I will read the inscription to the king and make the interpretation known to him. Honestly, in my first Bible, I had a little smiley face next to this one. You know why? By the time Daniel's called before the king, fortune wasn't that important. I mean, he could barely chew meat. Okay, so it really didn't matter. Fame didn't seem to bother him. He was old enough that he didn't care if people knew who he was. Power was something he had often throughout his life, and he watched it pay very few lasting dividends. Pleasure was, a warm fire, a good broth, some pleasant company. He didn't need much. See, one of the great things about the aging process, I know this doesn't sound fun to you. I know you're sitting there going, this is not great, but it really is. You need less to be happy. You don't have to look at the latest and greatest. Listen, you're going to get to the point where the new magazine will come out and you'll go, I don't want any of this stuff. I really don't. When I was young, I used to think it was going to be cool to have a boat. Guess what? I see a boat now and I see hours of maintenance. I thought it'd be cool to have this really big, beautiful house. It's like an anvil tied around your neck when dragging you into the sea. The more you have them, I really have become a minimalist. The reason I use Apple products is because there's one button. Okay? Honestly, I'm not doing a commercial. I'm just saying, I have so much stuff. Now you're at the point where your stuff can fit in a Volkswagen, but it's not always going to be like that. You're going to find that for a few years, it's going to multiply and multiply. And honestly, your stuff will be like rabbits. You'll walk in the room again and it's twice as much. There are people I know that have so much stuff, they have to move stuff to sit down in their house. If you get enough stuff as some of you have a dorm like that, they're all looking at each other and smiling, okay? Here's the thing, if you're already like that, woe unto you is what I have to say. I guess what I'm trying to say is that he grew into life into the point where all the temporary mess and the fleeting toys didn't matter. Life is good, but the final object of life for the person who really understands it is in the eternal, not in the temporal. So you're not trying to get more and more toys. Keep your stuff, O king. I have what I need. Now, since you called for me and I can be engaged in the culture, I'll tell you what you want to know. But I don't need your gold, okay? Because then I'm going to have to keep track of it. I don't want to keep track of it. Now, Daniel stayed engaged so that when the moment came, he was ready to be used of God. And this is important. In verse 18 it says, O King, the Most High God granted sovereignty, grandeur, glory, and majesty to Nebuchadnezzar your father. Look at verse 22. Yet you, his son Belshazzar, which would be actually grandson, you have not humbled your heart, even though you knew all this. What does verse 22 have to do with the theme of the book? 2 words, God rules. That's the theme of the book. God rules. God rules people who don't think that he rules them, he rules them. So he says, you have not humbled your heart. And you have exalted yourself against the Lord of heaven. And they have brought the vessels of his house before you and your nobles, your wives, your concubines have been drinking wine from them. And you have praised the gods of gold, silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone. And you know why he tells them that? You're sitting here going, well, duh, Daniel, we just read that a few verses before. Daniel wasn't there. So he walks in and tells them what he could not have known had God not shared it with him. You know, I wasn't here, but I understand from the Lord that this is the stuff you've been doing. Verse 24, then the hand was sent from him, and this description was written out. This is the inscription which was written out. Mene, mene, tekel, upharsin. The interpretation of this, mene, God has numbered your kingdom. The word mene means numbered. God has numbered your kingdom and put an end to it. So numbered, tekel is the word weighed. Peresh is the word divided. Upharsin is just another form of that word. Numbered, weighed, and divided is what it means. And so he explains it. You get down to verse 29, then Belshazzar gave orders. They clothed Daniel with purple, put a necklace of gold around his neck, and issued a proclamation concerning him that he now had the authority as the third ruler of the kingdom, which is exactly what you don't want to have the night before the kingdom falls. You would rather not get a business card that says, third runner-up. You'd like to be nobody. Guy who doesn't even know king. Never been there in the throne room. Not guilty. Now, what I think is that God provided this engaged servant. But disengagement is an undisciplined life. You're going to find that there is a temptation among many older people to disengage in life, to pull away. So, I want to remain engaged, but I don't want to, and here's my big line for chapter 5. You ready? Don't substitute rage for engage. Don't substitute rage for engage. Some people think I'm remaining engaged by complaining about the world. No, you're just raging. You're not engaging. And I have found that living in Sebring has helped me because there are a great many people here whose number of days ahead are much smaller than the number of days behind them. And it is a temptation for older people to get enraged but not engaged. I would just say to you that chapter 5 is a great word on aging alongside of Ecclesiastes 12. If you get sent to some place where you have to talk to people who are older, this can be an encouraging passage. Because Daniel is as old as dirt in the passage, and nevertheless God is using him and using him effectively.